When we picture World War I, we usually think of the mud, the trenches, and the barbed wire. But some of us might also think of the many feats of military technology that came to prominence during this period. Gas, tanks, and of course, the machine gun. Many designs of machine gun arose during World War I. The Hotchkiss, the Shosho, and the BAR, to name a few. But one of the most iconic machine gun designs of the First World War was, in my opinion, the Lewis gun. With its top-mounted magazine and oversized barrel shroud, I've always been fascinated just by the look of this gun, and I've always thought that owning one would make for a great conversation starter. The only problem with that, however, is that they cost at least $26,000. So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, you make one yourself. And last year, in the fall of 2020, that's exactly what I set out to do. I started assembling a World War I impression early last year at the very start of the pandemic, as a way of passing the time during quarantine. That kept me occupied, at least for a little while, but by the end of the summer, I had acquired every piece of gear that I could for that impression, and by that point, it had become clear that the pandemic was nowhere near over, and I needed a different project to occupy my time. So, in the fall, I ordered a Replica Lewis Gun Kit from a website called foxflyer.com, which is a website that sells, among other things, vacuform molds of Lewis guns, made from sheets of ABS plastic. Here's a photo of what one of those kits looks like straight out of the box. As you can see, the parts come in two halves embedded in a sheet, which you then cut around and then glue the pieces together and paint it to achieve the final result. Assuming you've done everything correctly, it should look something like this. Not bad, but as I was cutting the pieces, it very quickly became clear to me that the finished product was not going to have nearly the amount of detail fidelity I had envisioned when compared to an original Lewis. Even if I did everything correctly, it would only look authentic from a distance, and it was all thanks to the vacuform molding process. The contours were rounded and didn't have well-defined edges, so no matter what I did, the second you examined the thing from up close, it would be clear that it was just two empty halves of plastic glued together in the approximate shape of a Lewis gun. And that just wasn't going to cut it for me. I wanted something that could pass as the real deal, even when examined from up close. I just wasn't sure how to achieve that. So I scratched my head for a bit, and then I called my dad over, and we both looked at it and scratched our heads together, and eventually I had an epiphany. Star Wars. Star Wars is the answer. A lot of blaster designs from the original Star Wars trilogy are just old guns from World War II and World War I with various sci-fi greeblies slapped onto them. And one blaster in particular, the T-21 Heavy Blaster to be exact, is literally just a Lewis gun with the magazine removed and what looks like a piece of corrugated drain pipe placed over the barrel shroud. And considering how many people have built entire stormtrooper outfits from scratch, I figured at least one of those people must have a tutorial on how to construct a T-21 Heavy Blaster. So, I went off to the message boards of the 1st Imperial Stormtrooper Detachment, where, sure enough, a user called Panda Trooper had an entire in-depth tutorial on how to construct this particular model of blaster, complete with step-by-step instructions, pictures, required materials, and the dimensions of all of the various pieces. It was everything I could have asked for. All we had to do was follow the instructions, negate the sci-fi elements, and obtain a magazine, and we'd have ourselves a Lewis gun. The tutorial in Panda Trooper's post includes a template for each piece of the gun for tracing them to the right dimensions onto the wood frame that serves as the base for the entire piece. In this regard, my dad and I actually had a bit of a head start. Having had the pieces from the Foxflyer kit already cut out, we used those as our template. We started by tracing the outline of the stock of the gun onto a wood plank, which we then cut out using a jigsaw, leaving a narrow strip of wood running down the middle, which would serve as a support beam for the barrel shroud later on. We then constructed the lower half of the receiver out of a sheet of PVC using the same method. Here we differed from Panda Trooper's instructions because we figured that by using PVC instead of wood, we could achieve a more realistic final result for the metal components of the gun, without having to do a ton of wood sanding to make it appear smooth. For the chamber and the ejection port, we used a 2-inch diameter PVC pipe cut in half, and then glued to the wood core above the lower half of the receiver. Next, we moved on to the barrel shroud, which is where things started to get a little bit complicated, because the shroud of the Lewis gun is not a uniform thickness, it tapers at the end. So, to recreate that effect, we started with a 3.5-inch PVC pipe, which we then connected to a 2-inch PVC pipe using an adapter. And then to recreate that tapering effect, we applied Bondo to it, which is a strong putty that hardens as it cures. We applied it little by little to the tip of the barrel, letting it dry for a bit before applying more, and then eventually sanding it down until we achieved the desired result. For the top feed plate, we again used a sheet of PVC with a PVC pipe end cap cemented to the top to serve as the mechanism for holding the magazine in place. The magazine, incidentally, is one of the few actual metal components of the entire piece, as it is an original magazine ordered from International Military Antiques, although I strongly suspect it is not an original from World War I, but more likely from World War II or perhaps even post-World War II, as it arrived looking brand new. With most of the large components taken care of, it was time to move on to some of the smaller, finer details. We started by working on the cooling fins, which in Panda Trooper's build were constructed out of polystyrene, but we opted for a simpler approach and used foam board sheets, spray painted, and then attached to the front of the receiver and the back of the barrel shroud using a little bit of Bondo. Next, we constructed the rear sights out of wood paint mixing sticks. We had actually designed them to be fully functional, so at one point, this sight did actually flip up, but unfortunately, when I was painting the thing later on, the whole gun flipped over, and the rear sights took the brunt of the fall and actually completely snapped off. Easy fix, all things considered, but unfortunately, as a result of that repair job, these sights no longer function as intended. So let that be a word of caution to anybody watching this who might be thinking about making their own Lewis gun. I'd recommend using something a little bit stronger than wood painting sticks for the rear sights. With all of that out of the way, it was down to sanding some of the rough edges and adding some more Bondo and styrene sheets here and there to add detail to the receiver. Once that was done, it was on to painting. I used black spray paint on the body of the gun. After experimenting with flat, matte, satin, and glossy finish, I eventually decided to use a satin finish to give it a nice sheen without making it appear overly reflective. I could have kept it that way after that, but I decided I wanted to give it a more worn look, and for that I used something called Rub and Buff, which is essentially a silver paint that comes in a little tube you can apply it with your hands. So I dipped a little bit of it onto my fingertips, you don't need very much, and I applied it to any raised edges that would realistically see the most amount of wear. After that, I applied some more to a stiff paintbrush and dabbed it along the sides of the receiver and the barrel in order to simulate scratches. And with that, the piece was functionally complete, just in time for me to take it on the charity march that I participated in back in May. But there was one aspect that we weren't able to finish in time for that, and that was the bipod. For that, we once again used a combination of wood and PVC. We bent a metal bracket around the barrel shroud, then attached the two PVC legs underneath. For the feet, we used wooden dowels, which were whittled down to a point on one end, and after that, the screws were added, which are mostly just for show. And those are essentially just regular old screws, except for this butterfly screw up top, which is fashioned from, of all things, an old rabies tag. Some MacGyver action going on there. You might also notice a few minor changes to my overall kit as well to go along with the machine gunner theme. For instance, you may have noticed that I'm not carrying a rifle, and as such, I don't have the usual rifle ammo pouches. Instead, I have a special P08 waist belt, which is designed to be worn without the pouches. And in addition to that, I'm also carrying a Webley. It's not a real one, it's airsoft, but it is metal, so it still has the same approximate weight and feel. I actually distressed it a little bit with some sandpaper to once again give it a more weathered look. And I also have a Lewis gun badge on my sleeve here, if you'll excuse my somewhat crummy sewing job. And I got all of this stuff, minus the Webley, from Lawrence Ordnance out of Australia, which is a great place to pick up some more niche World War I kit items that a lot of other sites like What Price Glory and Soldier of Fortune don't carry, as long as you don't mind the extended shipping times. Anyway, that's pretty much all I can think of to talk about for right now. I do hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a long time in the making. Hopefully, if there's anyone out there who may be thinking of starting a similar project, they might find it useful. Check out Panda Trooper's original build instructions for a more in-depth tutorial if you're curious about starting your own Lewis gun project. I'll leave a link to that tutorial down in the description. But until next time, guys, have a good one, and as always, God save the King!